So one of the aspects of what we think is about agonistic memory or agonistic approach to history is about a multi-perspectivity, which is of course not a kind of sufficient condition for agonism or agonistic approach to history, but a necessary element, obviously. And as you will know, this principle of multi-perspectivity is generally recognized in modern history didactics, and also finds increasing its way into historical museums and exhibitions. And it is very much also supported, introducing multi-perspectivity in teaching history is very much supported by different European institutions, but also kind of non-governmental institutions, international institutions, by the Council of Europe, by the Euroclio, for example. And it is in fact so that many European museums very much stress their multi-perspectivity, or at least are being described as such. And as Graham Black puts it, this multi-perspectival approach has become increasingly important as Western society has become more multicultural. Thus, museums have begun to see their role change from the collection and presentation of a single authorized past to that of cultural mediator, incorporating and representing the memories of previously marginalized groups. And I think this globalization process, the widening and also deepening of the widening of the European Union, the deepening of European integration, in a way further prompted this process. And this is especially true for war museums, where conflict, in a way, lies at the core of the narrative of the story. What is, I think, our finding is that when you look at those different museums, then this multi-perspectivity is being understood in various ways, and it's also introduced by very different kind of museological or museographical means. I must say, I looked a bit for articles about that. I could find, there is much in general on multi-perspectivism sort of claim, but I could hardly find any articles which would in depth kind of analyze what this multi-perspectivity would really mean in the different museums. How is it introduced, especially for war museums? And the questions to be asked are, first, how is multi-perspectivity understood in different museums? What are the museological tools used to introduce this multivocality? And also, what are the limits and constraints of introducing multiple perspectives in historical museums and especially in war museums? And in my presentation, because of lack of time, I will focus only on 3 museums. The Historia in Perón, the German-Russian Museum Berlin Karlshorst, and the Military History Museum in Dresden, or all of them analyzed within UNREST. And as you already know, all of them were established or at least refurbished to a great part after 1990. And the first 2 of them, so Historiale and the German-Russian Museum Berlin Karlshorst, have very much this ambition to tell the story not purely from a national, but from a, whatever you just describe it, transnational or European, at least transnational perspective. The last case with the Military History Museum in Dresden is a bit different because, as you know, it's a museum of the Bundeswehr. It's clearly, in a way, focused on national history. We can discuss that. I have already so many points of discussion, which doesn't mean it's not done in a reflexive way. But still, my understanding is, well, we can come to that later. In for trying to analyze it, I use categories developed by German history didactics, which is on one hand multi-perspectivity, which would be featuring different experiences and viewpoints from the time, for example, by using personal stories from the time. And another kind of level of multivocality would be controversiality, which is presenting diverse, often competing, current historiographical interpretations. So it's sort of meta level of multi-perspectivity. All the three analyzed museums claim quite explicitly in their official publications and also interviews given by their by the staff members that they are multi-vocal, multi-voiced. However, I think each of them understands this multi-vocality in a totally different way. So first looking at this multi-perspectivity, which seems quite common in the analyzed museums. Such an approach is, for example, very well visible in the German-Russian Museum Berlin, Karlshorst, and also in the Historial in Perron. I think this multivocality, here again we can discuss, is very much enhanced by the sole structure of the museum. So we had on one hand a museum which is the German-Russian Museum, which is an institution which is bilateral from the kind of the setting is bilateral, and you have a an association which is German-Russian, and you have a scientific council which is composed to an equal part of Russian and German museum practitioners and historians. And you have the Historial, which is on one hand a local institution established and financed by the kind of local authorities, but which was set up by an international team of French, and truly to say not British, but US American historians and German historians, yes? And I think my reading of the exhibition is a bit different than that of Stefan. I think that this exhibition introduces in a very consequent manner both the German and the Soviet-Russian perspective on war. And the viewpoint shifts from exhibition chapter to exhibition chapter. So for example, we have the chapter Planning for War Against the Soviet Union, which is clearly presenting history from a German perspective, while the chapter The Soviet Union at War focuses on the Soviet experience. And this is, I think, done first of all by using artifacts, documents, photographs created by the respective side. So for example, in this part, Planning for War, you have actually only German documents, quotations from high-rank NS officials, and so on, while in the other chapter on Soviet Union at war, you have Soviet posters, everyday objects used by inhabitants of besieged Leningrad, and so on. And I think such an approach enables the curators presenting Soviet citizens not only as passive victims of the war, but also protagonists of the conflict in their own right. However, you will note, or it's obvious that the museum always has to make a selection of material, and introducing some historical perspectives means also leaving out others. And this is especially so if a museum has a, diplomatic mission to fulfill. My reading of this museum is that focusing on the German and Soviet viewpoints, the exhibition in Karlshorst at the same time silences other perspectives, which I think are also very important for the narrative on the war in the East, 1941, 1945, and the period before. Most prominently, I think, the Ukrainian and perspective, that of the Baltic states. Maybe I would not explain it in detail. We can come back to this during the discussion. The multi-perspectivity in Historial, I think, is of a quite different kind. So the museum shows objects, images, documents from very different sides of the conflict, and also representing experience of different types of participants. So those are not only soldiers, but also medical personnel, POWs, civilians in the occupied zones, and so on. Still, it seems that the curators rather strive to search for what was common for all the war participants than for the differences. As a through-going principle of the exhibition is to illustrate one topic or phenomenon, for example, war propaganda or physical suffering by objects from for all the three sides represented in the museum, so German, British, and French. There is a certain kind of space for showing different perspectives or different opinions. For example, there is a topic militarism, and on the other side you have an exhibition on pacifism, which shows that there were different standpoints to the war also during when it lasted. But those differences in opinion, they kind of go across national divisions, yes? So it seems that on the national level there were, between the different nationalities there were more similarities, and if there were differences, then they were within the nations, you had different opinions. So although both the German Russian Museum and the Historial introduced multi-perspectivity, this leads, I think, to very different ends. While the exhibition in Berlin underlines the past antagonism in different national perspectives, the Peron exhibition strives, as Sophie Vanish put it, to stage a common experience of war, multiplying different viewpoints but homogenizing the reading of the common experience. So you see that you have multi-perspectivity, but the kind of final effect can be very different, or the final message. Except the museum in Dresden focuses mainly on German military history. Of course, you have different paths. You have this thematic parcours, and then you have the chronological parcours. And I think this thematic parcours is not so nationally focused, but when you look at the chronological parcours, it is about German military history, to my understanding. So maybe this is the difference in reading also. At least most of the exhibits are of German origin, yes, so telling the story from German perspective. This is especially so in the chronological parcours, where the main protagonists are the Germans. So the exhibition does not introduce different national perspective as a through-going principle. However, where they are being introduced, it's sometimes done in a, I would say, much more radical way than it's done in the other two mentioned museums. Different standpoints are clearly formulated and confronted with each other. And doing so, the curators evoke past conflicts also in their emotional dimension. So one such example, which is I think quite well known, is the exhibition part in the thematic parcours dedicated to city bombings. And in this section of the exhibition, you have objects and personal stories related to the destruction of three cities during World War II, Wieluń in Poland, Rotterdam and Dresden. And the text on the bombing of Wieluń includes a quote belonging to a Polish inhabitant of the city, expressing his horror at the bombing. So, the bottom-up perspective in a very exact way. And on the other hand, you have a quote, this quote is juxtaposed with a quotation by a Luftwaffe pilot who described the town kind of from above, and describes this destruction of the town as a stirring spectacle. Yes, so you have really very, contradicting perspectives confronted in one place from that time. So in opposite to Karlshorst and Peron, the mission of which is international reconciliation, to my understanding in both cases, the museum in Dresden, at some points, it's not a through-going perspective, but at some points seems to implicitly question what one could say, I quote here, Christian, the reconciliation mantra. So, for example, for Rotterdam, for the bombings of Rotterdam, you have a quotation by Jeb Timmers, who in 2006, during an interview, says, or still expressed his hate towards the Germans, and said that he will be never able to forget what he had to endure when he was a youngster. Yes, so he says, actually, I can't forgive them, I hate them till now. There is no reconciliation. How much time do I still have?
About 10 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so this is about multi-perspective in this very strict sense, looking at perspectives from the time. On the other hand, you have controversiality. And I think, at least in the museums we have analyzed, I only talk here about 3, but I take also in consideration the others, and some others you've seen. This is much less common to introduce this controversiality in museum narratives, meaning the different kind of historiographical interpretation. And as stated by Fiona Duncan, museum professionals she interviewed beginning of the millennium, 2003 is the article. She interviewed them in several countries, including Australia, the US, and the UK. The museum professionals still tend to regard museums as temples, presenting to the furthest extent possible, of course, an objective and scientifically based interpretation of the past. And I think such an attitude is also shared by most of the curators in the museums we have analyzed within UNREST. So again, the Dresden Museum does not present different historical interpretations, at least not in the World War I and World War II sections. It introduces, however, another kind of multivocality by exposing the inner controversiality of objects. We struggled a bit also with Christian how to kind of phrase it or how to name it. One of the examples would be the way the V2 rocket is being displayed in the exhibition. The rocket is on one hand a part of the thematic parcours in the topic military and technology, and as such it is presented as a big technical achievement. On the other hand, the rocket is exhibited together with the British dollhouse with taped windows to protect them from air raid bombing, and a metal ball belonging to a prisoner of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Such an arrangement of objects allows showing the damaging effect of the weapon and also that it was produced by slave labor. So in a way you have one object and you show different readings of it. Yes, you can say it's part of technical history and it was a big technical achievement. On the other hand, you say, okay, but you can look at it from another perspective, and then it's part of terror and yes, and it caused. So it's one object that's being read from different perspectives. In a way, such an arrangement of yes, okay. One could say that the sole organization of the museum suggests from the outset such a what one could call conceptual multi-vocality or multi-perspectivism. That is, in fact, that the two tours, the thematic and the chronological, are proposed. And the thematic parcours, by focusing on several themes, for example, animals and military, suffering during the war, military and technology, is bound to act as in a plural perspectivistic manner, yes, so that you have sort of different approaches, scientific approaches to the same event or to the same history. Introducing a controversiality in a bilateral German-Russian museum proved to be, I think, even more difficult. From the very beginning on, it was quite clear that this Karlshorst Museum is to become a visible sign of German-Russian reconciliation. And already in the 90s, when the museum was set up, after the former Soviet museum was closed down, it was stated that in the meetings of the Association of the Museum, it was stated that the goal of the museum is to offer the visitors, I quote, a common Russian-German view on 20th century history. So despite controversies within the academic committee, the curators of this new exhibition new permanent exhibition opened in 2013, still tried to construct one single master narrative. And this urge for a univocal narrative can be very well illustrated. You can see it, I think, in different moments of the exhibition, but can be very well illustrated on the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The interpretation of the pact, the circumstances under which it was signed, and the intentions of the signatories which is still quite discussed among historians. And this issue also raised quite big discussions with this bilateral German-Russian academic committee. However, instead of presenting different interpretations, which was at one point proposed by some members of the committee, the curators decided for a compromise version stressing the defensive character of the pact for the Soviet Union and using cautious phrasing, conceding the aggressive tone of the secret protocol. As said, the controversies within the academic committee concerning this and some other topics was so big that some members proposed that in those cases where it was very difficult to reach a common narrative, this should be stated in the exhibition, so there should be different interpretation, or at least one should say that this was not consensual. But this never happened. And when asked about it in an interview, the director of the museum, Jörg Maurice, said, from a museological perspective, he would find this idea to present the exhibition in the exhibition different historical interpretation, he would find it very tempting, although not broadly practiced. One of the reasons it was not done, he said, was that, I quote, the diplomatic mission of the Karlshorst Museum is another. This is the consensus and the reconciliation. But I think one should be very cautious about reducing this issue to only politics. In fact, it's as Graham Black put it, a much broader issue of sharing authority for content and of trust in the museum as a public institution. And also the Perron Museum does not really introduce controversiality. It aims to be anti-didactic and interrogative, but the historical interpretation available in the permanent exhibition itself is generally univocal. When asked if they ever considered introducing historiographical controversies into the exhibition, the director of and the curators of the Historial said, so I understood at least, you can improve me, that recognizing the existence of different historical interpretations, they would feel responsible to present the one they find most plausible, that is that of the Perron school. On the contrary, Moret, the director of the Karlshaus Museum, he seemed quite comfortable with the idea of presenting different historiographical interpretations in the exhibition, of course, if not for the political reasons. And again, in the interviews, he said, sure, I'm a curator and I'm responsible for the exhibition, but I'm also a moderator, which means my job is to present also views I don't agree with as a historian and curator, and to say there are also other terms for the phenomena or other perspectives. I find this is a very appropriate for a multinational museum to convey this message to the audience. Okay, to sum up, you may remember the history of the fiasco of the Enola Gay exhibition in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1995, which was a very discussed case. And in this exhibition, the director of the NASM, Martin Harbit, wanted to juxtapose the US-American perspective on the bombing with that of, the, well, so to say, ground zero Japanese perspective. By exhibiting side by side the airplane, which bombed the city, or both cities, and artifacts from bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Finally, Harbit was forced to resign, and the exhibition has never been shown in this form. You can see the Enola Gay in a kind of very heroic manner now exhibited in the museum near to Washington, D.C. I think 2 decades later, of course, here we have USA, here we talk about Europe, so those are also different spaces, but I think 2 decades later, such multiple exhibitions on World War I and World War II are much more common, at least in Europe, and also find broader public acceptance. The principle of multi-perspectivity is widely applied in museums, although it finds very different manifestations and I think leads to very different ends, finally, as I tried to show. Much less common is the inclusion of competing historiographical interpretation, and despite the cultural turn of the 1970s and the following change in exhibition culture in the 1980s, such an approach remains still very controversial, I think at least in war museums. Thank you.